I'm Horror Whispers. A lot of people watching haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy our chilling tales, hit that subscribe button. Your likes, comments, and shares help our stories reach more curious minds. Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments, if you dare. They call it the loneliest road in America, but the truckers who drive Nevada's endless highways know the truth. You're never truly alone out there. Something watches from the desert darkness, something that feeds on isolation and preys on the desperate. These aren't just stories. They're warnings, whispered between drivers who stared into the abyss and lived to tell about it. My name is Jake Morrison, and I've been hauling freight across this country for 15 years. I've seen every mile of asphalt between Seattle and Miami, driven through blizzards that would make a polar bear shiver, and navigated mountain passes that would give a mountain goat nightmares. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on US 95 between Tonopah and Hawthorne that scorching July night in 2019. It was one of those Nevada summers where the desert doesn't cool down even after the sun disappears. My air conditioning had been struggling for the past 100 miles, making sounds like a dying whale. And by the time I hit that desolate stretch of highway, it finally gave up the ghost completely. The thermometer on my dashboard was reading 102 degrees at 11 p.m., and I was sweating through my shirt like I was sitting in a sauna. My fuel gauge was dancing dangerously close to empty, and the next scheduled truck stop wasn't for another 80 miles. That's when I saw it. A soft glow cutting through the heat mirages that were still shimmering off the asphalt despite the late hour. At first, I thought it was just another desert trick, the kind that makes you see lakes where there's only sand and rocks. But as I crested a small hill, there it was. A gas station, sitting about a quarter mile off the highway, connected by a narrow gravel road that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the Carter administration. The place looked wrong from the moment I laid eyes on it. The building was clearly old, probably dating back to the 70s or 80s, with that distinctive architectural style that screamed family business trying to make it in the middle of nowhere. But something was off about the way the light hit it. The entire structure looked charred and blackened, like it had been through a fire. Yet the pumps were clearly operational. I could see the digital displays glowing bright green in the darkness. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed over a decade and a half of long-haul trucking was screaming at me to keep that rig moving and find fuel somewhere else. But that gauge was practically kissing empty, and the nearest civilization was still hours away. Sometimes you don't get the luxury of following your gut when you're staring down the barrel of being stranded in the Nevada desert with no air conditioning and a truck that weighs 40 tons. I pulled off the highway and made my way down that gravel road, my headlights cutting through dust clouds. They looked like they'd been installed yesterday, modern digital displays and credit card readers that seemed completely out of place next to the burned-out hulk of the main building. I pulled up to the diesel pump and shut off my engine, immediately regretting it as the desert heat slammed into me like opening an oven door. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual desert odor of dust and sagebrush. This was the acrid, choking smell of smoke. Not fresh smoke, but old smoke. The kind that soaks into everything and never really goes away. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Yet somehow, the pumps were working perfectly. I slid my credit card and the display cheerfully asked me to select my fuel grade like nothing was wrong. As I was filling up, the door to the main building creaked open, and out walked a man in his 50s, wearing coveralls and a baseball cap. He looked normal enough at first glance, just your typical gas station attendant working the late shift. But as he got closer, I started noticing details that made my skin crawl. His coveralls were singed around the edges, and there were dark stains on them that could have been oil but looked suspiciously like burn marks. His hands, when he gestured toward my truck, were wrong. The skin looked waxy and discolored, like it had been burned and healed badly, but he moved them like they didn't hurt at all. He struck up a conversation like we were old friends, asking about my route and how long I'd been driving. His voice was friendly enough, but there was a quality to it that reminded me of someone talking through a throat that had been damaged by smoke inhalation. When I mentioned I was heading to Reno, he nodded knowingly and said he'd been working this station for over 30 years, that he'd seen thousands of drivers come and go. The fuel pump clicked off, showing I'd taken on nearly 200 gallons, but when I looked at the price display, my blood ran cold. It was showing prices from the 1980s, 89 cents per gallon for diesel. I figured it had to be a malfunction, but when I went inside to pay, the cash register was one of those old mechanical ones with the big buttons and the bell that rings when the drawer opens. The attendant acted like everything was perfectly normal, taking my money and giving me change like we were living in 1987. That's when I saw the newspaper sitting on the counter. The headline made my hands shake. Family of 4 dies in gas station fire. Attendant also killed in blaze. The date on the paper was July 23, 1987. I looked up at the attendant, and for just a moment, in the fluorescent light, I could see through his face. Beneath the illusion of normal skin was charred bone and empty eye sockets, but he kept smiling at me like nothing was wrong. I grabbed my receipt and ran for my truck, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I tried again. The sun hadn't moved in the sky since I'd arrived. It was still sitting in exactly the same position, like time had stopped. Through my rearview mirror, I could see other vehicles pulling up to the pumps. Cars and trucks from different eras, the drivers getting out and going through the same motions I had. All of them looking slightly wrong in the flickering light. I don't know how long I sat there trying to start my truck, but eventually the engine caught with a roar that sounded like salvation itself. I didn't bother with a careful exit. I floored it out of there, gravel spraying behind me as I hit the highway doing 60. In my side mirror, I could see the gas station getting smaller and smaller, but the light from it seemed to follow me for miles. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Against my better judgment, I drove back to that spot in broad daylight. The gravel road was still there, but it led to nothing but a burned-out foundation and the rusted remains of old fuel pumps. There was a historical marker nearby that I hadn't noticed in the dark. It told the story of the Desert Rose gas station, which had burned down in 1987, killing the owner and his family when a fuel line ruptured during a lightning storm. I reached into my pocket for my receipt, planning to throw it away and try to forget the whole experience. But when I pulled it out, the edges were singed and blackened, like it had been touched by flames that had been burning for over 30 years. I still have that receipt. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the desert, I take it out and look at it, just to remind myself that some fires never really go out, And some people never really leave their posts, even when they should have died decades ago. I'm Maria Santos, and before I tell you what happened to me on US 95 that November night in 2020, you need to understand something about me. I'm not the type of person who believes in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. I've been driving refrigerated loads across the Southwest for 12 years, and I pride myself on being practical, logical, and completely skeptical of anything that can't be explained by science or common sense. I haul perishable goods from California farms to markets across Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, which means I spend most of my time driving through the night to keep my cargo fresh and my delivery schedules tight. That particular night, I was hauling a load of organic produce from Bakersfield to Reno, taking my usual route up US 95 through the heart of Nevada. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the highway was completely empty, except for my rig and the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. The temperature outside was hovering around 40 degrees, which is perfect for maintaining the cold chain on refrigerated cargo. But it also meant that any wildlife should have been hunkered down somewhere warm, not wandering around the desert. I first noticed something was wrong about 20 miles south of Hawthorne. I caught a glimpse of movement in my passenger side mirror, just a dark shape that seemed to be running parallel to my truck. At first, I assumed it was a coyote, or maybe a wild dog, and I didn't think much of it. Desert animals sometimes get confused by headlights and will run alongside vehicles for short distances before breaking off and disappearing into the scrub brush. But this thing didn't break off. For the next 10 miles, every time I checked my mirrors, it was still there, maintaining the same distance and keeping perfect pace with my truck. I was doing 65 miles per hour on a straight stretch of highway, and whatever this animal was, it was matching my speed effortlessly. That's when I started to get nervous. No natural animal can sustain that kind of speed for that long, especially not across the rough terrain that bordered the highway. I tried to get a better look by adjusting my mirrors and turning on my running lights, but every time I thought I had a clear view, the thing seemed to melt back into the shadows between the sagebrush and Joshua trees. All I could make out was that it was large, much larger than any dog or coyote I'd ever seen, and it moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. About 15 miles later, the thing changed tactics. Instead of running alongside my truck, it started darting back and forth across the highway behind me. I could see it clearly in my rearview mirror now, and what I saw made my blood run cold. This wasn't any kind of animal I'd ever encountered. It was easily the size of a small car, with a sleek, muscular build that looked like a cross between a wolf and something much more predatory. Its eyes reflected taillights with an intense red glow that seemed to cut through the darkness, like laser beams. That's when my CB radio started acting up. Instead of the usual chatter from other drivers or the occasional trucker looking for a smoky report, all I was getting was static, punctuated by what sounded like low, rumbling growls. At first, I thought it was just interference from some kind of electronic equipment, but the timing was too perfect. Every time the creature moved, the growling intensified, and when it paused, the radio went silent. The temperature inside my cab started dropping, which should have been impossible. My heater was running full blast, and the truck's insulation is designed to keep the driver comfortable in any weather condition. But I could see my breath forming little clouds in the air, and frost was starting to form on the inside of my windshield. The whole truck felt like it was being enveloped by some kind of supernatural cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Then the creature did something that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. It leaped completely over my trailer, landing on the highway in front of my truck with a grace that should have been impossible for something that size. For a moment it turned to face me directly, and I got my first clear look at what had been stalking me for the past 30 miles. Its body was covered in coarse, black fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and smoke, or steam, was rising from its mouth and nostrils like it was breathing fire. Its eyes were definitely glowing red, not just reflecting my headlights. And when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of teeth that looked more like a shark's than a dog's. But the most terrifying thing wasn't what it looked like. It was the intelligence I saw in those burning red eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. It was studying me, calculating something, making decisions based on information I couldn't understand. And then it started moving again, but not away from my truck. It began running ahead of me, staying just at the edge of my headlight range, like it was trying to lead me somewhere. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around and head back the way I'd come, I found myself following it. Something about the way it moved, the purposeful way it kept looking back to make sure I was still behind it, made me think that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe it was trying to help. For the next hour, the creature led me through a series of winding mountain roads that I'd never traveled before, even though I thought I knew every truck route in Nevada. The highway markers looked familiar, but the landscape seemed subtly wrong, like I was seeing a slightly altered version of roads I'd driven hundreds of times. The whole time, my CB radio continued producing those low overtime. Just as the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, the creature suddenly stopped and turned to face me one last time. It let out a sound that was part howl, part roar, and completely unlike anything I'd ever heard from any earthly animal. Then it bounded off into the desert scrub and disappeared, leaving me alone on a stretch of highway that I slowly recognized as being just north of Walker Lake. I pulled over at the next rest area, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I heard the sirens. About a quarter-mile ahead, right where I would have been if I'd maintained my original route and schedule, there was a massive accident scene. A livestock truck had jackknifed and rolled, spilling cattle across both lanes of the highway. The driver was trapped in his cab, and from what I could overhear on the emergency responders' radios, he'd been there for hours. If I hadn't been led on that detour by whatever that creature was, I would have come around that blind curve at highway speed and plowed straight into that accident. The impact would have killed me instantly, and probably would have finished off the livestock driver too. Instead, I was able to call for additional medical assistance and help direct traffic around the scene until the highway patrol could get more units there. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes, when I'm driving that same stretch of US 95 late at night, I catch glimpses of red eyes watching me from the desert shadows. I don't know what it was, demon, guardian angel, or something else entirely, but I know it saved my life that night. And sometimes, when the CB radio starts picking up those low, rumbling sounds, I whisper a quiet thank you into the darkness and hope that whatever's out there can hear me. The other drivers think I'm crazy when I tell this story, but I don't care. I know what I saw, and I know what it did for me. In a place as empty and unforgiving as the Nevada desert, maybe we need protectors that are just as wild and untamed as the landscape itself. Maybe that hellhound wasn't hunting me at all. Maybe it was guarding me, making sure I made it safely through its territory to help someone who needed it even more than I did. My name is Tommy Chen, and 3 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my trucking career by following lights that should never have existed. I was 23 then, fresh out of driving school and cocky as hell about my first solo cross-country run. My dad had been trying to talk me into the family business for years, but I wanted to see America from behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, not from the passenger seat of his delivery van back in San Francisco. Looking back now, I should have listened to him when he warned me that the desert plays tricks on young drivers who think they know everything. It was my second week on the road, hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, when everything went wrong on the lonely stretch of I-80 east of Winnemucca. I'd been making good time, staying ahead of schedule and feeling pretty proud of myself for handling the rig like I'd been doing it for years instead of days. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and I was settling in for what should have been a routine night drive through Nevada, when my GPS suddenly went black. Not just lost signal, completely dead. Like someone had pulled the plug on it. That's when I realized my cell phone was showing no bars either. I wasn't too concerned at first because I figured I was just passing through one of those dead zones that are common in rural Nevada, and I'd driven this route once before during training with my instructor. But as the miles rolled by and my electronics stayed dark, I started to feel that first flutter of anxiety in my stomach. The highway markers looked familiar enough, but something about the landscape seemed subtly wrong. Like I was seeing it through a filter that made everything appear slightly different than I remembered. I probably should have pulled over at the next truck stop and waited until morning to sort things out. But I was young and stupid and didn't want to blow my delivery schedule on my first independent run. That's when I saw the lights ahead, maybe 5 miles in the distance, glowing soft and steady against the dark desert sky. They looked like the kind of lights you'd see from a small town, not bright enough to be Las Vegas or Reno, but definitely indicating some kind of civilization where I could get my bearings and maybe find someone to help me figure out what was wrong with my electronics. I followed those lights for what felt like hours, but they never seemed to get any closer. Every time I thought I was making progress, they'd appear to drift a little further away, always staying at the same distance from my headlights. At first, I figured it was just an optical illusion, the kind of thing that happens when you're driving across flat terrain at night and your depth perception gets confused. But after a while, I started noticing that the road beneath my wheels was getting on a major interstate. The landscape around me was changing too. Instead of the familiar desert scrub and distant mountains I expected to see along I-80, I was driving through terrain that looked more desolate and alien than anything I'd ever seen in Nevada. The few plants I could make out in my headlights looked wrong somehow, twisted into shapes that didn't match any desert vegetation I'd learned about in my pre-trip planning. The hills in the distance had an odd, angular quality that made them look more like broken teeth than natural rock formations. That's when my GPS suddenly flickered back to life, and what I saw on the screen made my blood turn to ice water. According to the satellite positioning, I was 50 miles off any mapped road, driving through terrain that the system showed as completely empty desert. The nearest highway was marked as being 20 miles to the south, but that was impossible because I hadn't turned off I-80 and I'd been driving in a straight line the entire time. I hit the brakes and brought my rig to a complete stop, heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The lights I'd been following were still there, maybe a quarter mile ahead now, but something about them looked different. Instead of the warm, welcoming glow of a small town, they had a cold, metallic quality that reminded me of light reflecting off glass or polished metal. And they weren't steady anymore. They were pulsing, slowly, like a heartbeat made of light. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around immediately, I decided to get out of my truck and walk toward the lights to see what they actually were. The desert air was bitter cold, much colder than it should have been for that time of year, and completely silent in a way that felt unnatural. No wind, no insect sounds, no distant highway noise, just absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. As I walked closer to the lights, the ground beneath my feet started feeling unstable, like I was walking on loose sand instead of solid earth. That's when I realized the lights weren't coming from buildings or street lamps at all. They were reflections, bouncing off twisted metal and broken glass that was scattered across what looked like the edge of an enormous pit. I was standing at the rim of an abandoned mine shaft that had to be at least 100 feet across, and God knows how deep. The metallic debris I was seeing was the wreckage of vehicles, cars, trucks, maybe even other 18-wheelers that had followed those same mysterious lights and driven straight into the pit. Some of the wreckage looked recent, with paint that still gleamed in my flashlight beam, but other pieces were so rusted and weathered they must have been there for decades. The lights I'd been following were nothing more than my own headlights. Started backing away from the edge. But that's when I felt the ground starting to give way beneath my feet. The loose gravel and sand at the rim of the mine shaft was beginning to slide, carrying me toward the edge faster than I could scramble backward. I could hear my truck's engine still running behind me, but it sounded impossibly far away, and I realized with growing horror that I'd walk much further from my rig than I'd thought. The slide accelerated, and for a terrifying moment, I was certain I was going to join all those other vehicles at the bottom of that pit. But somehow, maybe through pure luck or adrenaline-fueled desperation, I managed to grab hold of a piece of rebar that was jutting out of the crumbling edge and pull myself back to solid ground. I crawled away from that mine shaft on my hands and knees, not trusting my legs to hold me up, until I could see my truck's running lights cutting through the darkness. Getting back to my rig felt like the longest walk of my life, and starting it up was even worse, because for a few horrible seconds, the engine just turned over without catching. But finally, it roared to life, and I put that truck in reverse and backed away from that death trap as fast as I dared. My GPS was working again, showing me exactly how to get back to I-80, though the route it displayed took me through terrain that looked completely different from what I'd driven across while following those lights. The next morning, I spent hours researching that area online, and what I found made me realize how lucky I was to be alive. That mine shaft had been the site of multiple disappearances over the past 60 years. Local records showed that 47 people had vanished in that area since 1963. Most of them drivers who'd simply disappeared along with their vehicles. Recent satellite images of the mine showed tire tracks leading right up to the edge, and when I zoomed in close enough, I could make out the glint of metal at the bottom of that pit. The locals call them miners' lights, and the stories say they're the spirits of prospectors who died in claim disputes back in the 1800s, still trying to lure people to their deaths out of spite and loneliness. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and I know how close I came to becoming just another reflection in that deadly light show. Now, when I drive through Nevada at night, I keep my eyes fixed on the highway markers. I'm Roy Baker, and I've been driving long-haul routes for 28 years. In all that time, my CB radio has been my closest companion, more reliable than any co-driver, and more comforting than any truck stop coffee. I've talked to thousands of drivers over the years, shared road conditions and weather reports, warned about speed traps and construction zones, and listened to the endless chatter that makes those lonely miles bearable. That's why what happened to me on US 6, the loneliest road in America, was so terrifying. It wasn't just the voice I heard, it was the silence that came before it. It was early October 2021, and I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Sacramento to a job site outside Denver. I'd chosen to take US 6 across Nevada because it's usually faster than the interstate routes, even though it means driving through some of the most isolated country in the lower 48. I've made that run dozens of times over the years, and I know every mile marker, every rest stop, and every place where the CB chatter usually picks up from other drivers making the same crossing. But that night was different. From the moment I left Tonopah, heading east, my CB was completely silent. Not just quiet, absolutely dead air, like every trucker in Nevada had simultaneously decided to stop talking. I tried switching channels, adjusting my squelch, even tapping the microphone to make sure my radio was working, but I couldn't raise a single voice. The silence was so complete, it felt oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. After about 2 hours of driving through that eerie quiet, I started hearing something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from static, but gradually, it resolved into what sounded like a human voice. Someone was transmitting on Channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, but their signal was so weak and distorted, I could barely make out what they were saying. The voice belonged to a man, probably middle-aged from the sound of it, and he was clearly in distress. He kept repeating coordinates and asking for help, saying his truck had broken down, and he was stranded somewhere in the desert. His transmission was breaking up badly, cutting in and out like he was broadcasting from the edge of his radio's range. But I could catch enough fragments to understand that he was scared and running out of water. What bothered me wasn't just the desperation in his voice. It was the fact that no other drivers were responding to his calls. In all my years on the road, I've never heard a distress call go unanswered for more than a few minutes. Truckers take care of each other out here, especially in country this remote and dangerous. But this man's pleas for help were met with nothing but silence, like I was the only person in Nevada who could hear him. I tried responding several times, keying my microphone and asking for his exact location and the nature of his problem. But he didn't seem to hear me. He just kept repeating the same coordinates over and over, his voice getting more panicked with each transmission. The coordinates he was giving placed him somewhere south of my current position, maybe 30 or 40 miles off the main highway, in terrain that would be almost impossible to reach with a big rig. Against my better judgment, I started trying to track down his signal. I had a decent GPS unit in my truck, and I programmed in the coordinates he kept broadcasting. The location showed up as empty desert, no roads marked anywhere near it. But I figured maybe my maps were outdated, or there might be some kind of mining road or ranch access that wasn't on the official charts. As I got closer to the coordinates, the man's voice became clearer, and what I heard made my blood run cold. He wasn't just asking for help anymore. He was describing my truck. He knew I was driving a red Peterbilt, knew my approximate location on US 6, even seemed to know details about my cargo that should have been impossible for him to see from wherever he was stranded. He started addressing me by name, even though I'd never identified myself on the radio. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and tried to get a better fix on his signal with my directional antenna. According to my equipment, his transmissions were coming from a location about 10 miles south of the highway, in an area that my GPS showed as completely empty desert. But when I looked in that direction, there was nothing but darkness. No lights, no signs of civilization. Nothing that would indicate someone was out there with a radio. The man's voice was getting stronger now, and he was saying things that made no sense. He was describing road conditions from decades ago, talking about highway markers that had been changed years before I started driving this route. He mentioned truck stops that had closed in the 80s, and construction projects that had been completed before I got my CDL. It was like he was broadcasting from some earlier version of Nevada, a ghost frequency carrying echoes from the past. I tried one more time to respond to him, but this time, something impossible happened. As soon as I keyed my microphone, his voice stopped mid-sentence, and after a moment of static, I heard my own voice coming back through the speaker. It was definitely me, but I wasn't saying the words that were coming out of the radio. My voice was asking for help, giving coordinates, describing a breakdown that hadn't happened to me. Terrified, I reached for my radio to turn
Help that would never come, broadcasting into a void that seemed to swallow their words without ever sending back a response. I finally managed to shut off my CB, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the phantom voices had been. I sat in my truck cab for probably 20 minutes, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just some kind of atmospheric anomaly or equipment malfunction. But deep down, I knew I'd stumbled into something that couldn't be explained by science or technology. When I got to the next truck stop, I asked the other drivers if they'd heard anything unusual on their CBs that night. Every one of them said their radios had been working fine, full of the usual chatter and road reports. Nobody else had heard the distress calls or experienced the dead air that had terrified me for hours. I spent the next few days researching the coordinates that the phantom voice had been broadcasting. What I found chilled me to the bone. That location had been the site of a truck accident in 1979. A driver named Eddie Morrison had jackknifed his rig during a blizzard and died of exposure before help could reach him. According to the accident report, rescue teams found his CB radio still transmitting when they recovered his body 3 days later. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next several months, I started hearing from other drivers who'd experienced similar phenomena on Nevada's remote highways. Phantom voices calling for help, CB frequencies that seemed to broadcast from the past, and always that same
terrible silence that preceded the supernatural transmissions. We started calling it dead air, and experienced drivers learned to recognize it as a warning sign. My own CB started malfunctioning after that night on US 6. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through isolated country, it picks up transmissions that shouldn't exist. I hear my own voice asking for help, broadcasting coordinates from locations I've never been. Other drivers tell me they've heard me on their radios, calling for assistance from the middle of nowhere, but when they try to respond, there's nothing but static. I don't know if I'm becoming part of that phantom frequency, or if the desert is somehow using my voice to lure other drivers into its trap. All I know is that every time I hear dead air on my CB, I turn it off and keep driving, because some calls for help are better left unanswered. My name is Linda Hayes, and I've always believed in helping people when they're down on their luck. In my 17 years of driving cross-country routes, I've given rides to more stranded motorists than I can count. People whose cars broke down, folks who ran out of gas, even a few drivers who'd been in minor accidents and needed to get to the nearest town for help. It's part of the trucker code, looking out for each other and for regular folks who find themselves in trouble on America's highways. But what happened to me on US 95 between Las Vegas and Tonopah during a thunderstorm in August 2018 taught me that sometimes the person asking for help isn't a person at all. I was hauling a load of furniture from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City when I hit the worst summer storm I'd ever encountered in Nevada. The Weather Service had been tracking a rare thunderstorm system moving across the desert, but their predictions hadn't prepared me for the reality of driving through what felt like a tropical hurricane in the middle of the driest state in the Union. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick my wipers couldn't keep up, and the wind was rocking my 50,000-pound rig like it was a toy truck. Lightning was striking close enough that I could smell the ozone in the air, and the thunder was so loud it drowned out my diesel engine. I'd slowed down to maybe 30 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, trying to find a safe place to pull over and wait out the worst of the storm. That's when my headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, maybe 100 yards ahead. Even through the rain, I could see it was a person, clearly in distress, waving their arms to flag me down. They were soaked to the skin and looked like they'd been standing out there for quite a while. I started slowing down even more, checking my mirrors to make sure I could pull over safely without getting rear-ended by another vehicle. The figure was wearing what looked like a long coat or jacket, and they had their head down against the rain, so I couldn't make out much detail about their appearance. But their body language screamed desperation, the way they were waving, the slumped posture of someone who'd been fighting the elements for too long. I brought my rig to a stop about 20 feet past where they were standing and put on my four-way flashers. Through my passenger window, I could see them approaching my truck, moving carefully through the mud and standing water that had collected on the shoulder. I leaned over to roll down the window and ask them what kind of help they needed, expecting to hear the usual story about a broken-down car or being stranded without a cell phone signal. But when they looked up at me, I felt my heart skip a beat. Something was wrong with their face that made me uneasy. Still, they were obviously in trouble. And the storm was getting worse by the minute. I couldn't just leave someone out there to potentially die of exposure. I told them to climb up into the passenger seat, and they did so with movements that seemed strangely graceful for someone who should have been exhausted and hypothermic. As they settled into the seat next to me, I got a better look at them in the light from my instrument panel. They appeared to be middle-aged, wearing clothes that looked oddly old-fashioned. A wool coat that seemed like something from the 1970s or 80s, and boots that had clearly seen better days. Their hair was plastered to their head from the rain, but it was cut in a style that reminded me of pictures from decades past. We started talking as I pulled back onto the highway, and their conversation was polite enough, though there was something slightly off about the way they spoke. They used expressions and slang that sounded dated, like they hadn't kept up with how language had evolved over the past few decades. They told me they'd been traveling from Las Vegas to Reno when their car broke down, and they'd been walking for hours trying to find help. The story was plausible, but something about the way they told it bothered me, like they were reciting lines from a script they'd memorized long ago. What really started to unnerve me was the way they seemed to know things about the road that they shouldn't have known. They mentioned landmarks and mile markers that weren't there anymore, talked about truck stops that had closed years ago, and gave directions using highway numbers that had been changed decades before I started driving. When I tried to point out these inconsistencies, they just smiled and changed the subject. But there was something unsettling about that smile, something that made me avoid looking directly at them. I kept trying to get a good look at their face in my rearview mirror, but every time I glanced back, the angle seemed wrong, or the lighting wasn't quite right, or they'd have their head turned away at just the wrong moment. It was like my eyes were refusing to focus on their features, sliding away every time I tried to get a clear view. The more this happened, the more agitated I became, but I told myself it was just the stress of driving in such dangerous conditions. About an hour into our journey together, a lightning flash illuminated the inside of my cab for just a split second, and in that brief moment of stark white light, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Where my passenger's face should have been, there was nothing but smooth, blank skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an expanse of pain. My passenger, turned toward me, and I could swear I heard them speak even though I'd just seen that they had no mouth. Their voice was the same as it had been all along, polite, slightly old-fashioned, and completely normal. They asked if I was all right, said they'd noticed I seemed upset, and offered to help with the driving if I was getting tired. The normalcy of their words contrasted so sharply with what I'd seen that I wondered if I was having some kind of breakdown. I tried to convince myself that the lightning flash had created an optical illusion, that the combination of stress, fatigue, and dangerous driving conditions was making me see things that weren't there. But every time I glanced at my passenger, I found myself unable to focus on their face, like my brain was protecting me from seeing something too horrible to process. They continued making conversation, telling me about their life, their family, their reasons for traveling, but their stories kept contradicting each other in subtle ways that suggested they weren't real memories, but fabricated details meant to maintain the illusion of being human. The strangest part was that despite my growing terror, I felt an overwhelming sense of sympathy for whatever was sitting beside me. There was a profound sadness in their voice when they talked about trying to get home, a loneliness that seemed to permeate everything they said. They weren't threatening me or trying to harm me. They just wanted company, wanted someone to talk to during what seemed like an endless journey through the dark and storm. As we approached the outskirts of Tonopah, my passenger asked me to drop them off at an old cemetery on the edge of town. They gave me specific directions to a graveyard I'd never heard of, but when I found it, the place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Weathered headstones leaned at crazy angles, and the iron fence was rusted through in places. My passenger thanked me for the ride, said they hoped I'd stay safe on the rest of my journey, and stepped out into the rain. I watched them walk through the cemetery gates and disappear among the headstones, moving with that same strange grace they'd shown when they first climbed into my truck. The next morning, after the storm had passed, I drove back to that cemetery in daylight, telling myself I just wanted to make sure the person I'd helped had found shelter somewhere safe. What I found was a grave marker with a name and dates that matched the story my passenger had told me about their life, except the death date was from 1982. I still pick up hitchhikers when I see them stranded on the highway, because I believe it's the right thing to do. But now I pay more attention to the details, the way they move, the things they say. Companionship is worth the fear of not knowing exactly what they are. My name is Dave Mitchell, and for 8 years I held one of the most classified trucking contracts in America. I can't tell you exactly what I was hauling, or which government agency I worked for, but I can say that my route took me along State Route 375 in Nevada, the road they call the extraterrestrial highway, usually in the dead of night, when civilian traffic was at its absolute minimum. My security clearance was higher than most military officers, and I'd signed enough non-disclosure agreements to fill a phone book. But what happened to me on that road in March 2019 went so far beyond anything covered in my briefings that I'm not even sure the people who hired me would believe it. I've been making the same run twice a month for almost a decade, driving specially modified trucks with radiation shielding and electronic countermeasures that I wasn't supposed to understand. The cargo compartments were sealed with locks I didn't have keys to, and I had strict instructions never to stop except at predetermined checkpoints, where armed guards would inspect my rig and verify that everything was still secure. The route always took me past the perimeter of Area 51, though from the highway all you can see is empty desert and the occasional warning sign threatening deadly force against trespassers. That particular night started like any other. I'd picked up my load at a nondescript warehouse outside Las Vegas just after midnight, gone through the usual security protocols, and headed north on 375 toward my delivery point near Tonopah. The desert was crystal clear, with no moon and more stars visible than you ever see in populated areas. My radio was picking up the usual chatter from military air traffic controllers, mostly routine communications about training flights and patrol schedules. It was just past 3 in the morning when I first noticed the lights. At first, I thought they might be aircraft from Nellis Air Force Base conducting night exercises. But these lights were behaving in ways that defied everything I knew about aviation. They weren't following straight-line flight paths or maintaining consistent altitudes. Instead, they seemed to be dancing in the sky, moving in complex patterns that looked almost choreographed, like they were responding to some kind of music I couldn't hear. As I watched them through my windshield, the lights began moving closer to the highway, dropping down until they were maybe 1,000 feet above the desert floor. That's when I realized they weren't separate aircraft at all, but parts of a single massive object that had to be at least the size of a football stadium. The thing was triangular, completely silent, and covered in lights that pulsed in patterns that seemed to respond to my truck's movement along the highway. My first instinct was to reach for my radio and report what I was seeing to my dispatch, but before I could key the microphone, it kept running because it was mostly mechanical. But my GPS, CB radio, cell phone, and even my digital dashboard displays all went black at exactly the same moment. The only light in my cab was coming from whatever was hovering above me, and that light was getting brighter by the second. I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do, but the object stayed with me, matching my speed perfectly and maintaining the same position relative to my truck. Every few minutes, beams of intense white light would sweep across the highway in front of me, illuminating the asphalt so brightly it looked like daylight. During these sweeps, I could see every detail of the desert landscape with impossible clarity, as if the light was revealing things that normal illumination couldn't show. That's when I started experiencing what I can only describe as time distortion. According to my mechanical watch, I'd been driving for about 20 minutes since my electronics failed. But when I looked at my odometer, it showed that I'd traveled over 200 miles. The math didn't work. Even if I'd been doing 100 miles per hour the entire time, which I definitely hadn't been, I couldn't have covered that much distance. My fuel gauge, which was one of the few instruments still working, showed that my tanks were somehow fuller than they'd been when I started. The really terrifying part was that I had no memory of driving those 200 miles. One moment I was passing a familiar landmark about 30 miles north of the Area 51 turnoff, and the next thing I knew I was approaching Tonopah with no recollection of the journey in between. It was like someone had edited a chunk of time out of my life, leaving me with nothing but the vague sense that something incredibly important had happened during those missing hours. When my electronics finally came back online, I was parked at a truck stop just outside Tonopah with my engine off and no memory of stopping. The sun was rising, and according to my phone, it was almost 7 in the morning. I should have reached my delivery point hours earlier, but somehow I'd lost an entire night. My cargo seals were intact, my truck showed no signs of damage, and everything seemed normal, except for the fact that I couldn't account for the last 6 hours of my life. I tried to continue with my delivery, but when I reached the checkpoint, things got very strange very quickly. The guards who were supposed to meet me weren't just military. They were accompanied by people in civilian clothes who claimed to be from various government agencies I'd never heard of. Instead of the routine inspection I was expecting, they subjected me to hours of questioning about what I'd experienced on the highway. The problem was that I couldn't give them the answers they were looking for because I genuinely didn't remember most of what had happened. They showed me satellite images appeared to be floating about 50 feet above the highway with no visible means of support. In one image, there was a massive triangular shadow visible around my truck, but when I looked at the photos, I felt nothing but a vague sense of unease, like looking at pictures of someone else's dream. The questioning went on for 3 days, during which time I was kept in isolation at a facility I'd never seen before. They brought in doctors who ran medical tests I didn't understand, and psychologists who seemed more interested in what I couldn't remember than in what I could. Finally, a man in an expensive suit told me that my security clearance was being revoked due to psychological unreliability, and that my contract was terminated effective immediately. They gave me a substantial severance payment and made me sign additional non-disclosure agreements. but they couldn't give me back the memories I'd lost or explain what had happened to me on that stretch of highway. For months afterward, I had dreams about floating through star-filled space, about voices speaking in languages that weren't quite human, and about being shown things that my conscious mind refused to retain. I found work driving conventional freight routes, but I avoided Nevada entirely for almost 2 years. When I finally worked up the courage to drive Route 375 again, it was during daylight hours with plenty of other traffic around. Even then, I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead and tried not to think about the gaps in my memory or the dreams that still woke me up in cold sweats. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through isolated areas, I check my rearview mirror and think I see lights following me that move in ways aircraft shouldn't be able to move. My new trucks don't have the specialized equipment my old rig carried, but I've installed a dashboard camera that runs continuously and uploads footage to cloud storage in real time. I tell myself it's for insurance purposes, but really it's because I'm terrified that someday I'll lose time again and need proof of what happened to me. I still have that footage from the one night I drove Route 375 again. For most of the trip, it shows exactly what you'd expect. Empty highway, desert landscape, normal truck cab interior. But there's a 20-minute segment where the video goes completely white, like the camera was overwhelmed by some incredibly bright light source. When the image returns, I'm parked at a different location with no memory of how I got there, and my fuel gauge is reading higher than it was before the whiteout occurred. I've never shown that footage to anyone, because I'm not sure I want to know what it might prove. Some experiences are too big for the human mind to process, and maybe the people who took my memories were actually trying to protect me from something that would have driven me insane. All I know for certain is that there are things moving through Nevada's night skies that don't follow the laws of not table,
Physics as we understand them. And sometimes they take an interest in the people who drive the loneliest roads in America. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been driving the Western routes for 22 years. But it wasn't until I started making regular stops at Big Jim's Truck Plaza in Ely, Nevada, that I truly understood why truckers have always been a superstitious bunch. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 6 months in 2020, during some of the loneliest drives of my career, when the pandemic had emptied the highways and left those of us still working feeling more isolated than ever. But even in that isolation, I learned that some places hold on to their protectors long after death, and sometimes those guardians are more reliable than any living person you'll ever meet. Big Jim's has been a fixture on US 50 for over 70 years, one of those family-owned truck stops that somehow survived the corporate takeover of the trucking industry. The current owner, Jim Jr., inherited the place from his father, who built it back in 1953 after coming home from Korea with a Purple Heart and a determination to create something lasting in the Nevada desert. The original Big Jim had been a trucker himself before the war, and he designed his truck stop with drivers in mind: clean restrooms, good food, fair fuel prices, and mechanics who actually knew how to work on big rigs. I first heard about the Phantom from an old-timer named Carl, who'd been running freight through Nevada since the Carter administration. We were sitting in Big Jim's restaurant at 3 in the morning, the only customers in a place that would normally be bustling with activity, when Carl started telling me about the ghost trucker who'd been protecting drivers for decades. According to Carl, the Phantom was a driver named Eddie Kowalski, who died in a blizzard during Christmas week of 1953, just a few months after Big Jim's opened for business. The story goes that Eddie had been driving through one of the worst winter storms in Nevada history when he spotted a family stranded on the side of the road with their car buried in a snowdrift. Instead of continuing to the safety of the truck stop, Eddie stopped to help, using his truck to pull their car out of the snow and then following behind them at low speed to make sure they reached shelter safely. But the storm intensified while he was helping them, and by the time Eddie tried to continue his own journey, the road had become impassable. They found his truck 3 days later, completely buried in snow, with Eddie frozen at the wheel just 5 miles from Big Jim's parking lot. Carl claimed that Eddie had been watching over drivers ever since, appearing to warn them about dangerous conditions or to guide them to safety when they were in trouble. I listened politely, the way you do when an old-timer is sharing trucker folklore. But I didn't really believe it until I had my own encounter with whatever presence haunts the highways around Ely. It happened on a Tuesday night in October when I was hauling a load of mining equipment from Salt Lake City to a job site outside Tonopah. I've been fighting a nasty head cold for days, and the combination of medication and fatigue was making it hard to stay alert behind the wheel. About 30 miles east of Ely, I felt my eyelids getting heavy and realized I was in danger of microsleeping, that deadly state where you drift off for just a few seconds, but wake up to find your truck drifting into oncoming traffic or off the road entirely. I was looking for a safe place to pull over for a power nap when I noticed headlights in my mirrors that seemed to be following me unusually closely. The driver behind me was maintaining a consistent distance, not trying to pass despite having plenty of opportunity on the straight, empty highway. After about 10 miles of this, the other truck started flashing its lights in a pattern that veteran drivers use to communicate with each other. Long flashes followed by short ones. The kind of signal that usually means pull over or check your equipment. I couldn't see any obvious problems with my rig, but the other driver kept signaling, so I finally pulled over at the next wide spot to see what was wrong. As soon as I stopped, the truck behind me pulled alongside, and I got my first good look at the driver. He was wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. A heavy wool jacket, work boots, and a baseball cap with a trucking company logo I didn't recognize. His truck was an old Kenworth that had to be at least 70 years old, but it was maintained in perfect condition, with chrome that gleamed even in the darkness. The driver rolled down his window and called out to me in a voice that carried easily across the desert air despite the wind. He told me there was black ice ahead, that the temperature had dropped faster than the weather service had predicted, and that several trucks had already jackknifed in the next 15 miles. He suggested I wait at Big Jim's until the road crews could sand the highway, and he offered to follow me there to make sure I made it safely. I was grateful for the warning, because I hadn't noticed any change in road conditions, but as we started driving again, I could feel my tires losing traction on patches of invisible ice that would have been deadly at highway speeds. The phantom driver stayed behind me with his flashers on, providing extra visibility and warning other vehicles about the hazardous conditions ahead. Every time I hit a particularly bad patch of ice, his headlights would flash to let me know he was still there, still watching out for me. When we reached Big Jim's, I pulled into the parking lot, expecting the other driver to follow me so I could thank him properly and maybe buy him a cup of coffee. But when I looked in my mirrors, there was no sign of the old Kenworth anywhere. The highway behind us was completely empty, like the other truck had simply vanished into the desert night. Describing the vintage Kenworth and the driver in the wool jacket, Jim Jr. got a strange expression on his face and asked me to describe the driver in more detail. When I mentioned the baseball cap with the trucking company logo, Jim Jr. went behind the counter and pulled out an old photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed a group of drivers standing in front of Big Jim's in what looked like the early 1950s, and there, in the center, was the man who just saved me from a potentially fatal accident.
Jim Jr. explained that I'd met Eddie Kowalski, the phantom trucker who'd been protecting drivers on that stretch of highway for almost 70 years. He said Eddie appeared most often during dangerous weather conditions, warning drivers about hazards they couldn't see and guiding them to safety when they were in trouble. Some drivers reported seeing him during blizzards, others during fog or sandstorms, but he always appeared when someone needed help the most. Over the next few months, I heard similar stories from dozens of other drivers who stopped at big gyms. A woman named Sarah told me Eddie had warned her about a drunk driver weaving through traffic ahead of her. A rookie driver named Tony said Eddie had guided him through a dust storm that had reduced visibility to zero. An older driver named Pete claimed Eddie had appeared in his CB radio transmissions, giving him directions to avoid a multi-vehicle pileup that would have killed him. The stories all had common elements: the vintage truck, the driver in period clothing, the way Eddie would appear exactly when drivers needed help most, and then vanish as soon as they reached safety. Some people thought he was trapped by guilt over not reaching big gyms before the storm killed him, doomed to help other drivers make journeys he couldn't complete himself. Others believed he stayed by choice, that his love for the trucking community was so strong it transcended death. I've driven past that stretch of highway hundreds of times since that night, and I've never seen Eddie again. But I always slow down when the weather turns bad, and I keep my CB tuned to the emergency channel just in case, because I know that somewhere out there in the Nevada desert, a driver who died trying to help others is still making his rounds, still watching over the brothers and sisters who follow the same lonely roads he traveled 70 years ago. Jim Jr. keeps Eddie's photograph on the wall behind the cash register, and drivers from all over the country stop by to leave small offerings: a cup of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, a lucky coin. It's become a shrine to the idea that some bonds are stronger than death, and that the best of us never really leave the roads we loved in life.
My name is Sam Rodriguez, and I've been carrying the weight of the worst night of my trucking career for 3 years now. What I witnessed on I-80 near Battle Mountain in December 2021 challenged everything I thought I understood about time, fate, and the possibility of changing events that seemed destined to happen. I've told this story to exactly 4 people: my wife, my priest, a therapist, and now you. Because most folks would think I'd lost my mind. But I know what I saw, and I know what I tried to do, even if I'm still not sure whether I succeeded or just made everything worse. I was driving a load of construction materials from Reno to Denver when I came across what looked like the aftermath of a horrific multi-vehicle accident about 15 miles east of Battle Mountain. It was just past midnight, and the highway had been mostly empty for the past hour, with only the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. The weather was clear and cold, with that crystalline desert air that makes distant lights look closer than they actually are. The wreck was spread across both eastbound lanes and well into the median, involving at least 6 vehicles that I could see: 2 tractor-trailers, 3 passenger cars, and what looked like a minivan. Emergency vehicles were already on scene, their red and blue strobes painting the desert landscape in surreal colors that made the twisted metal look even more nightmarish. I slowed down like any responsible driver would, both out of respect for the victims and to give the first responders room to work. As I crept past the accident scene at maybe 20 miles per hour,
I could see paramedics working frantically over several people who'd been pulled from the wreckage. The damage was extensive. One of the trucks had jackknifed and rolled, spilling its cargo across several hundred yards of highway, while the passenger vehicles looked like they'd been crushed by some enormous fist. I said a quick prayer for everyone involved and continued on my way, grateful that I hadn't been traveling this stretch of road 30 minutes earlier. I called 911 from my cell phone to report additional details about the accident, but the dispatcher told me they already had units on scene and thanked me for my concern. I also put out a call on my CB radio to warn other drivers about the lane closures and delays they could expect in the area. It was the kind of thing veteran drivers do automatically. We look out for each other, share information about road conditions, and try to prevent additional accidents when we can. The next morning, I was having breakfast at a truck stop in Utah when I overheard two drivers talking about a major accident near Battle Mountain. They were describing the same wreck I'd witnessed, but according to them, it had happened the night before, which was impossible, but they insisted I was mistaken about the timing. One of them showed me a news report on his phone that confirmed the accident had occurred on December 18th. But I was absolutely certain I'd seen it on December 17th. I tried to convince myself that I'd gotten confused about dates, that the stress and monotony of long-distance driving had played tricks on my memory. But when I checked my logbook and GPS records, they clearly showed I'd driven past Battle Mountain on the 17th, not the 18th. I documented my route meticulously, as required by DOT regulations, and there was no way I could have been wrong about something that basic. 3 weeks later, I was making the same run from Reno to Denver, and as I approached the stretch of highway where I'd seen the accident, I found myself slowing down, even though there was no reason to expect any problems. The road was clear, weather conditions were good, and traffic was light. But something made me cautious, some instinct that I'd learned to trust over 15 years of professional driving. That's when I saw the accident happening again. The exact same accident, involving the same vehicles in the same positions, unfolding in precisely the same sequence I'd witnessed 3 weeks earlier. I watched in horror as the lead truck jackknifed, causing a chain reaction that swept up every vehicle behind it. The minivan flipped 3 times before coming to rest upside down in the median. The passenger cars crumpled like aluminum cans. It was identical to what I'd seen before, down to the smallest details. I pulled over and called 911, but this time, the dispatcher seemed confused by my report. She said they weren't showing any accidents in that area, and when I looked back at the highway, it was completely empty. No wreckage, no emergency vehicles, no signs that anything had happened. Just empty asphalt stretching toward the horizon under a star-filled sky. I sat in my truck for almost an hour trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The accident had been absolutely real while I was watching it happen, complete with the sounds of crushing metal and breaking glass, the smell of burning rubber and spilled fuel, even the voices of the paramedics calling out medical instructions. But it had vanished the moment I tried to get help for the victims. Over the next several months, I drove that route 4 more times, and each time I witnessed the same accident at exactly the same location. It always happened at night, always involved the same vehicles, and always disappeared when I tried to intervene. I started researching the history of that stretch of highway, and discovered that a major accident matching the one I kept seeing had indeed occurred there, but it was in 1987, 34 years before I first witnessed it. The original accident had killed 8 people, including a young family with 2 small children. Cause was a truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel, but several witnesses reported that the accident scene had seemed somehow wrong, like the vehicles involved were from different time periods, and the damage patterns didn't match the physics of what should have happened. I became obsessed with understanding what I was seeing and whether there was anything I could do to prevent it. I consulted with physicists, paranormal investigators, and even a few people who claimed to be experts in time anomalies. Most of them thought I was delusional, but a professor at the University of Nevada suggested that certain locations might be prone to what he called temporal echoes, events so traumatic that they imprinted themselves on the fabric of space-time and replayed endlessly like a broken record. On my sixth encounter with the phantom accident, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of just observing and then calling for help that would never come, I positioned my truck across both eastbound lanes about a quarter-mile before the spot where the accident always began. I turned on my hazard lights and emergency flashers, creating a barrier that would force other vehicles to slow down or stop entirely. For 3 hours, I sat there blocking the highway, turning away every vehicle that approached and explaining that there was a dangerous situation ahead. Most drivers were understanding, though a few were angry about the delay. Highway patrol eventually showed up and threatened to cite me for obstructing traffic, but I convinced them to let me stay until dawn by claiming I'd seen debris on the road that created a safety hazard. When the sun came up and I finally moved my truck, I drove slowly through the area where the accident always occurred. The highway was empty and peaceful, with no signs of the tragedy that had played out there so many times. I never saw the phantom wreck again, and when I checked news reports from that night, there were no accidents reported anywhere in Nevada. I don't know if I actually prevented something terrible from happening or if I just broke the cycle of a temporal echo that had been replaying for decades. All I know is that 8 people died on that stretch of highway 37 years ago, and maybe, just maybe, I was able to give them the peace they deserved by ensuring their tragedy wouldn't repeat forever. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in changing the past, but in preventing it from becoming the future.